What happened back then? What led him to kill? Those elements are still present today.
The village was still. Even a crow's caw echoed too loudly. In September 2000, that fragile peace was shattered. Inside a modest home, an elderly couple lay dead. But it was the strange, haunting detail that would grip the entire province. A clean, deliberate hole punched into each of their foreheads. It was a signature, that of a predator who was just beginning. Rumors of a hammer-wielding fiend spread like wildfire, fear seeping into every corner of the village. Behind it all, lurking in the shadows, was Yang, China's worst serial killer with more than 60 victims. Today, we recall his haunting and chilling story. A quiet village under threat. September 2000 in rural Henan province was quiet. Villages like Minquan County were stitched together with narrow, dust-choked lanes and low brick homes. Children played under the waning sun, chasing makeshift balls or laughing through the evening air, while elders tended to their small gardens or gathered under eaves to sip tea and exchange stories. Life here was predictable, simple, safe, or so it seemed. The first cracks in that sense of security were subtle. Small thefts began to appear in village reports, each dismissed as misfortune or the occasional petty criminal passing through. A basket of vegetables stolen here, a missing tool there. Nothing seemed extraordinary, and yet these minor violations hinted at something far more sinister. Homes once considered impervious now felt exposed. Wooden doors, once bolted against the occasional wind, could no longer guarantee safety. By late September, local authorities had received multiple complaints about break-ins in Minquan and surrounding counties, but the pattern had not yet revealed itself. The quiet unease escalated in early October. An elderly couple in the village of Zhangzhuang was found dead inside their modest home. As mentioned earlier, there was an unnervingly distinctive hole in each of their foreheads. The police were initially baffled. A local man was wrongfully arrested, spending weeks in custody before evidence proved his innocence. While the authorities scrambled, rumors rippled through the villages. Fear settled like dust, thick and suffocating, changing the way people moved through their streets. Children no longer played near the edges of the village, and neighbors stopped gathering in the evenings. This was the start of Yang Xinhai's reign of terror, although at the time, no one knew his name. He knew how to move unnoticed, to blend into communities while quietly plotting. As the weeks passed, more homes across Henan, Hebei, Shandong, and Anhui provinces were violated. Yang's method was precise. He chose isolated families, often in villages far removed from the main roads. He sometimes wore socks over his shoes to avoid leaving tracks and scouted his targets meticulously, observing routines and noting vulnerabilities. Families were attacked in the dead of night, blinds pulled aside only to reveal the horrors within. Entire households were slaughtered. In some cases, he even committed assault. Despite the growing body count, police departments initially treated each murder as an isolated incident. Coordination between provinces was limited, and the sporadic nature of the attacks made patterns difficult to trace. But the brutality was unmistakable. Farmers began sleeping in shifts, locking their doors, and keeping weapons close at hand. Families began moving into groups for protection. By 2002, authorities began to notice a signature pattern. Victims were struck with extreme force, often with a hammer, and their foreheads sometimes bore the same clean, horrifying mark. There were telltale signs of premeditation, doors broken in a specific way, tracks erased, and misleading evidence left behind. The monster behind the tragedy. Yang Xinhai's story began in a small village in Zhengyang County, Henan Province, in 1968, where he was born into a family struggling against the relentless grip of poverty. From the earliest years, life was harsh, and survival was a daily test. School offered little escape. By his early teens, Yang had dropped out. He moved from one menial job to another, construction, farming, odd deliveries, but each position seemed to exploit him. Employers withheld wages, opportunities evaporated, and the seeds of anger quietly took root. By the late 1980s, Yang's petty resentments had hardened into criminal tendencies. He began with theft, but he wasn't a natural at it. Yet, arrests followed. Prison stints became a recurring part of his life. These brief confinements exposed him to hardened criminals and reinforced a worldview of distrust and resentment. By the time he left jail, Yang was embittered, calculating, and increasingly detached from the society that had repeatedly failed him. He learned from every mistake, but only the wrong lessons. Personal relationships offered no reprieve. He struggled to connect. His life was marked by isolation and rejection. A failed romantic relationship in the mid-1990s left him emotionally scarred. These failures compounded his growing sense of alienation, shaping the mindset of someone who viewed other people not as companions, but as obstacles, or worse, targets. Outwardly, Yang was unremarkable. Locals remembered him as quiet, introverted, a drifter who came and went without drawing attention. He blended seamlessly into rural communities. This inconspicuousness was his greatest asset. While others saw an ordinary laborer, Yang was meticulously observing routines, assessing vulnerabilities, and mentally mapping a path for his crimes. His calm exterior hid a mind meticulously planning violence, making him both unpredictable and terrifying. By the late 1990s, petty theft was no longer enough. Yang's criminality escalated into violent assaults. He began targeting individuals in isolated circumstances, testing his ability to intimidate and dominate. These early acts of aggression were only the beginning. They were about to lead to something far more severe. Local police records from Shandong and Henan provinces in the 1998 to 1999 list several assault cases connected to a man matching Yang's description, though none foreshadowed the scale of carnage he would unleash. Each betrayal, each failed job, each rejection built on the last. By the time he began his killing spree in 2000, these factors had coalesced into a singular, lethal focus. He was no longer just a thief or a frustrated laborer. He was a predator. However, witnesses often described him as polite, almost shy, until the moment he struck. He exploited the trust inherent in close-knit rural communities, where doors were unlocked and strangers were rarely questioned. Villagers had no reason to suspect that behind this quiet exterior lurked a man capable of killing entire families without hesitation. By the end of his spree, Yang Xinhai would be responsible for 67 confirmed murders across 4 provinces. The murder spree begins. September 2000 marked the beginning of the nightmare. Yang Xinhai had already spent years refining his skills as a thief and petty criminal. Now, those skills would escalate into a spree of unimaginable violence. Following the murders of the elderly couple in Zhangzhuang village, the quiet rural communities of Henan, Shandong, Hebei, and Anhui began to realize that something far more sinister was unfolding. The second confirmed victims were a small family in a neighboring village, discovered a few weeks later in early October. The family of 4, a father, mother, and 2 young children, was found in their home by relatives who had come to visit after noticing they hadn't been seen in days. The scene shocked neighbors. Doors left ajar, a sense of struggle evident in the overturned furniture, and the entire household gone silent. News of these murders slowly made its way into regional newspapers and television broadcasts, initially reported as isolated crimes. Local journalists recounted the stories of quiet families, hardworking farmers, and children whose futures had been stolen. The coverage was factual but gripping. By late 2000, the story had begun to attract national attention. The press began to refer to the unknown perpetrator in ominous terms, speculating about a wandering criminal who targeted villages at night. Despite the growing media interest, police efforts struggled to match the scope of the crimes. By mid-2001, the number of victims had steadily increased. In Shandong province, a family of 5 was reported missing in a remote village. A neighbor discovered them after noticing the absence of lights and the family's livestock wandering unattended. Another case involved an elderly couple in Hebei province, known locally for their contributions to the village school and community. They were found alone in their home after friends went to check on them when they failed to appear at a local festival. Despite the mounting body count, the police were unable to identify the perpetrator. Each provincial force investigated the murders within its own jurisdiction, but the remoteness of the villages, poor communication infrastructure, and limited resources hindered coordination. Evidence was sparse. Footprints often washed away by rain. Break-ins left few physical traces, and witnesses were scarce. Local officers initially arrested individuals who seemed suspicious, but in every case, these arrests led to dead ends, leaving the real killer free to continue. The failure of authorities to prevent further murders increased public anxiety, and communities began taking extraordinary measures to protect themselves. By 2002, newspapers ran features on the so-called Hammerman, speculating about his identity, motives, and whereabouts. Television segments interviewed terrified villagers who described the sense of dread that had settled over their homes and fields. Even radio broadcasts offered warnings and tips for families living in remote areas, advising caution and encouraging reporting of strangers. To mislead investigators, Yang sometimes left evidence implicating others, such as tools or footprints that suggested a different perpetrator, or staged thefts designed to point suspicion elsewhere. These fall guys created confusion, slowed police efforts, and deepened fear. Between September 2000 and November 2003, Yang would kill 67 people, traveling an estimated 2,000 kilometers to strike across 4 provinces. The scale of his violence was staggering. In many cases, the level of planning was apparent. Windows were broken in a precise manner. There were minimal blood trails. Entry points were carefully chosen to avoid alerting neighbors. Yang occasionally observed homes for days before striking. As the years passed and the numbers piled up, authorities eventually began to notice a pattern. Police investigation, piecing together a monster. The first breakthrough came when investigators began comparing notes. Although the killings occurred hundreds of kilometers apart, striking similarities emerged. Victims were almost exclusively isolated families living in small villages. Entry points into homes were forced, yet done with precision. A chilling signature appeared repeatedly, a clean, deliberate hole in the forehead of certain victims. Male victims were often struck first, while female victims were sometimes assaulted. Furniture overturned, belongings rifled through, but often nothing stolen. The brutality, the patterns, and the recurring signature wounds pointed toward a single perpetrator. Police began constructing a profile of the man behind the carnage. He was described as transient, drifting between villages to avoid detection. Introverted and nondescript, he could easily blend into local communities. A quiet laborer or a lone wanderer, unnoticed until it was too late. Investigators speculated that he had prior criminal convictions, likely for theft or assault, and possessed a level of physical strength and familiarity with rural terrain that allowed him to strike swiftly and vanish without a trace. Despite these deductions, he remained unpredictable. The investigation faced formidable logistical hurdles. Villages were remote, often accessible only by dirt roads or narrow paths, and communication between provincial police units was slow and cumbersome. Sharing evidence across jurisdictions was cumbersome. Forensic laboratories were limited in capacity, and many crime scenes were contaminated or altered before investigators could arrive. Yang Xinhai exploited these weaknesses. He wore socks over his shoes to avoid leaving footprints, carefully chose unmonitored routes, and occasionally left misleading evidence to divert suspicion. Task forces were formed, pooling resources from multiple provinces to cross-reference murder sites, timelines, and eyewitness accounts. Patrols were increased around villages, and checkpoints were established along roads connecting affected regions. Investigators relied heavily on local tips, often tracing sightings of unfamiliar men who appeared to be wandering through rural communities without an obvious purpose. Close calls were common. Villagers would report suspicious individuals, but the killer often slipped through unnoticed, blending seamlessly with ordinary laborers, traders, or drifters. The tension in these rural communities was palpable. Farmers slept with knives under pillows. Families took turns keeping watch, and even routine chores were approached with caution. One night in late 2002, in a remote area of Hebei province, near the village of Anping, a local villager spotted a solitary man wandering near a farm. The stranger's movements were hesitant. He was observing the property rather than interacting. This matched the description that authorities had been circulating. A drifter, quiet, nondescript, and seemingly harmless to anyone who wasn't watching closely. The villager immediately reported the sighting to the local police, providing a detailed description of the man's clothing, gait, and direction of travel. Officers arrived within an hour, combing the surrounding fields and dirt paths, but by that time, the man had vanished without leaving a trace. In a separate incident several weeks later in Shandong province, a farmer encountered a suspicious figure near his property late at night. Recognizing the warning signs of previous attacks, the farmer attempted to confront the man. The stranger lunged with a hammer, forcing the farmer to retreat in terror to avoid serious injury. The attacker, as usual, disappeared into the darkness before anyone could intervene. The encounter left the community profoundly unsettled, with neighbors increasing patrols and villagers organizing night watches to guard against the possibility of another attack. Investigators, meanwhile, intensified their efforts to map the killer's movements. Police from Henan, Shandong, Hebei, and Anhui provinces began compiling reports of near misses alongside confirmed murders, looking for geographical, temporal, and behavioral patterns. Each report was cross-referenced for commonalities, the type of villages targeted, the layout of homes, the time of night attacks occurred, and the socioeconomic profile of the victims. Analysts noticed that Yang typically struck in remote villages with minimal neighbors nearby, often after carefully observing routines for several days. Victims were usually families or couples living in relative isolation, suggesting he sought out targets whose vulnerability allowed him to operate without interruption. As these patterns emerged, authorities attempted to predict potential targets. Police increased patrols along suspected routes, established checkpoints near vulnerable villages, and deployed informants to monitor suspicious individuals. Despite these measures, successfully preventing a murder remained rare. Yang's mobility and caution allowed him to evade capture repeatedly, striking unpredictably across provinces. Investigators noted his methodical preparation. He studied homes in advance, sometimes waiting days before attacking, and always ensured that his entry and exit routes were unobstructed. In addition, he often left misleading clues, such as signs suggesting forced entry by others, to confuse authorities. His attacks were deliberate and ritualized, consistent enough to suggest obsessive planning, but varied in location and timing enough to frustrate conventional policing. His behavior patterns and strategy became less and less obscure to the police, even as the full horror of his crimes continued to unfold. By late 2003, the net was finally closing. Capture, trial, and execution. November 2003 brought an end to nearly 3 years of terror across rural China. Yang Jinhai, the man who had murdered 67 people across Henan, Shandong, Hebei, and Anhui provinces, was apprehended when a local resident reported a stranger loitering near a village in Henan province. On the morning of November 5th, police arrived at the scene in Shangqiu County, finding Yang sitting quietly, nondescript, unassuming. The arrest was surprisingly calm. Yang offered no resistance, and the officers, unaware of the full scale of his crimes at that moment, simply took him into custody. Yet, as investigators began to assemble the evidence linking him to dozens of murders, the enormity of what they held in their hands became terrifyingly clear. During interrogation, Yang was unnervingly calm. Within days, he confessed to all 67 murders, detailing the killings with precision, recounting locations, dates, and methods. Henan, Shandong, Hebei, and Anhui authorities compiled a timeline that corroborated his confessions. Yang displayed no remorse. On the contrary, he reportedly expressed regret that he had not been able to kill more. His lack of emotion shocked investigators and the public alike, revealing a chilling detachment from human life. Statements collected during interrogation showed him recounting his crimes as though reading from a ledger, cataloging each act of brutality with chilling clarity. Yang's trial began shortly thereafter, a courtroom in Zhengzhou packed with families who had lost loved ones, journalists documenting the case, and officials determined to see justice done swiftly. The proceedings were shocking in their intensity. Prosecutors presented physical evidence from dozens of murder scenes, fingerprints, footprints, tools, and the distinctive wounds that had become his signature. Photographs of crime scenes were shown to the court, leaving many in the audience visibly shaken. Relatives of victims recounted their grief, describing the terror that had upended entire villages and the sleepless nights that had defined their lives since September 2000. Throughout the trial, Yang's demeanor remained unnervingly composed. He did not attempt to evade responsibility or plead for leniency. When asked to reflect on his actions, he spoke in measured tones, showing no signs of remorse or human empathy. This cold detachment only amplified the horror of his crimes and confirmed for the court and observers the premeditated, methodical nature of his spree. Psychologists who attended the trial later noted that his behavior exemplified a rare combination of antisocial personality traits and calculated criminal intelligence. After a brief deliberation, the court found Yang guilty on all counts. The death sentence was pronounced, and the sentence was carried out without delay. On February 14, 2004, in accordance with the judgment, Yang Xinhai was executed by firing squad. The aftermath of Yang's crimes left deep scars. Villages in Henan, Shandong, Hebei, and Anhui were profoundly affected. Many families relocated, unable to remain in homes marked by tragedy. Children who had witnessed the fear in their parents or the aftermath of attacks carried trauma into adulthood. Rural communities, once close-knit and trusting, became more vigilant, doors locked at night, neighbors wary of strangers. Local law enforcement agencies, criticized initially for failing to connect early crimes, implemented improved coordination and communication between provinces. This was a direct consequence of the challenges exposed by Yang's spree. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.